October 14, 1912. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A man steps out of a hotel waving to an enthusiastic crowd. Suddenly, a shadow lunges forward. A flash of fire, a deafening crack, and a .38 caliber bullet tears into his chest. Most men would fall, most men would scream for a doctor. But this was no ordinary man. Minutes later, he walked onto a stage, looked out at a stunned audience, and declared, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." For the next 84 minutes, with blood pooling in his shirt and a bullet lodged near his ribs, he delivered one of the most defiant speeches in human history. This is the incredible, almost unbelievable story of Theodore Roosevelt, a man built so tough that not even an assassin's bullet could silence him. To understand how a man could survive a gunshot wound and proceed to give an hour-and-a-half-long political speech, you have to understand the sheer force of nature that was Theodore Roosevelt. He was not born a giant. In fact, he was a sickly, asthmatic child, so frail that his family feared he wouldn't survive to adulthood. But young Teddy made a choice. He decided to build his body to match his indomitable spirit. He embraced what he called the strenuous life. He boxed, he lifted weights, he rode horses, and he climbed mountains. By the time he reached adulthood, he had transformed himself into an absolute powerhouse of energy and willpower. He was a Harvard graduate, a published historian, a New York City police commissioner, and a rancher in the unforgiving Badlands of the Dakota Territory. He did not know how to back down from a challenge, and he certainly did not know how to fear. This relentless drive took him all the way to the White House. As the 26th President of the United States, Roosevelt became a legendary figure. He took on the nation's most powerful corporate monopolies, championed the conservation of millions of acres of wilderness, and projected American power across the globe. He was a man of action, a leader who led from the front lines. When his presidency ended in 1909, the world thought Teddy Roosevelt would finally retire quietly into the history books. They were wrong. Roosevelt went on a brutal year-long safari in Africa, followed by a demanding tour of Europe. The man simply could not sit still. And by 1912, as he watched his successor, William Howard Taft, turn away from the progressive policies he had fought so hard to establish, Roosevelt felt a familiar fire burning in his chest. He decided he was not done fighting for the American people. Roosevelt attempted to win the Republican nomination for the 1912 election, but the party machine blocked him. Undeterred, he did something unprecedented. He broke away and formed his own political party, the Progressive Party, which quickly became known as the Bull Moose Party. When reporters asked him if he was fit for another grueling presidential campaign, Roosevelt famously barked back that he felt as strong as a bull moose. The moniker stuck, and it perfectly captured the spirit of the campaign. It was a vicious, chaotic three-way race between Roosevelt, the incumbent Taft, and the Democratic challenger, Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt traveled thousands of miles, delivering passionate, roaring speeches to packed arenas, attacking corruption, and demanding justice for the working class. The political atmosphere was frantic, polarized, and dangerous. This brings us back to that fateful autumn evening in Milwaukee. The campaign was reaching its boiling point. Roosevelt was scheduled to speak at the Milwaukee Auditorium. Before the event, he dined at the Gilpatrick Hotel with his inner circle. As he left the hotel and climbed into an open-top car, the street was packed with cheering supporters and onlookers. Roosevelt stood up in the car, raising his hat to acknowledge the crowd. In the dense crowd stood a man named John Schrank. Schrank was an unemployed saloon keeper who had been shadowing Roosevelt across several states, waiting for the perfect moment. Schrank claimed that the ghost of the assassinated President William McKinley had appeared to him in a dream, telling him that Roosevelt was responsible for his death and needed to be stopped. As Roosevelt smiled and waved, Schrank stepped out of the shadows, raised a cold steel revolver, and aimed directly at the former president's chest. A single shot rang out through the crisp night air. The smell of gunpowder filled the street. The crowd gasped in horror, and a split second later the scene erupted into absolute chaos. Roosevelt's stenographer, a quick-thinking man named Albert Martin, lunged across the car and tackled Schrank to the ground, disarming him. The crowd turned into a furious mob, shouting to string him up and kill him on the spot. Roosevelt, pushed back into his seat by the impact, remained eerily calm. He looked at the frantic crowd, then looked down at the assassin. In a booming, commanding voice, Roosevelt shouted, "Don't hurt him! Bring him here. I want to look at him." The police pulled Schrank up, and Roosevelt stared into the eyes of the man who had just tried to end his life. "You poor creature," Roosevelt muttered. He then ordered the police to take Schrank into custody and ensure he was not harmed by the enraged citizens. It was only then that the people around Roosevelt realized what had happened. They looked at his coat and saw a dark, spreading stain of blood. His friends and campaign managers panicked, begging him to rush to the nearest hospital. But Roosevelt shook his head. He put his hand inside his coat and felt his chest. He coughed into his hand, checking for blood. Seeing no blood in his saliva, Roosevelt, with his extensive knowledge of hunting and anatomy, concluded that the bullet had not pierced his lung. If his lung wasn't punctured, he reasoned, he wasn't dying. And if he wasn't dying, he had a speech to deliver. He refused all medical attention, looked at his terrified staff and said, "You get me to that auditorium. I am going to make this speech." How did he survive? It was a miracle of pure physics and heavy paperwork. Inside Roosevelt's breast pocket sat two items that saved his life. First, a 50-page manuscript of the very speech he was about to give, folded completely in half. Second, a heavy, solid metal spectacles case. The .38 caliber bullet had to pass through his thick overcoat, then punch through the dense steel of the glasses case, and finally pierce through all 100 pages of the folded manuscript. This incredible barrier sapped the bullet's deadly kinetic energy. By the time the bullet tore through his flesh and slammed into his chest wall, it had slowed down significantly. It fractured his fourth rib and stopped just inches away from his heart, safely lodged in his right chest muscle. The very words he had written to speak to the American people had literally shielded his heart from death. When Roosevelt arrived at the Milwaukee auditorium, the news of the shooting had already spread like wildfire through the backstage. The organizers were frantic, begging him to cancel. Roosevelt ignored them, straightened his jacket over his bloody shirt, and walked out onto the massive stage. The audience of 10,000 people fell into a breathless, stunned silence as they saw him step up to the podium. He looked frail, but his eyes burned with an intense, unyielding fire. He raised his hand for quiet, looked out at the sea of anxious faces, and delivered the opening line that would echo through history. He told them he had just been shot, but that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. To prove his words, he unbuttoned his vest, showing the crowd the blood-soaked white shirt underneath. A collective gasp rippled through the arena. For the next 84 minutes, Theodore Roosevelt stood at that podium and spoke. His voice was weaker than usual, sometimes dropping to a raspy whisper, but the conviction behind his words was deafening. His managers stood behind him in absolute agony, ready to catch him if his knees buckled or if he fainted from blood loss. Every time they tried to step in and stop him, Roosevelt fiercely waved them off, demanding they sit down. He spoke about his vision for America, about social justice, about the duty of a citizen, and about the corruption of the political system. He used the very manuscript that had saved his life, holding up the papers which now featured a clean, jagged bullet hole blasted right through the center of the text. He told the crowd that he did not care a rap about being shot, because he was fighting for a cause greater than any single man's life. Only after he uttered his final words and the crowd erupted into a roaring, thunderous ovation did Roosevelt finally consent to go to the hospital. Doctors who examined him later were completely astounded by his resilience. They determined that trying to extract the bullet would be far more dangerous than leaving it inside him. Roosevelt carried that piece of lead in his chest muscle for the rest of his life, a permanent, Internal Medal of Honor. He lost the election of 1912, but his legendary display of raw courage cemented his status as an immortal icon of strength and grit. Theodore Roosevelt proved to the world that physical toughness is nothing without a fierce, unbreakable spirit. He was a man who looked death straight in the eyes, told it to wait, and finished his job. If this journey into the past has captivated you, don't forget to leave a like. It's the best way to support this project and keep history alive. To continue unraveling the mysteries of the most fascinating figures who ever walked this earth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss our next trip through time. Until next time.